Good morning, everybody. It is great to see you all here. It's great to have some guests with us this morning, and we're very grateful for you being here. It's also great to see some people we haven't seen in a while, and it's great to have them back with us as well. I mean multiple people. I'm not singling anybody out. We are grateful also to have those who are joining us online. We're grateful that you're here, and we hope that technology continues to work and that you can comment down below, let us know that you're here so that we can get to know you that way as well. I do want to reiterate that we would love to have updated family photos. The goal of doing it the way that we are is that you get to choose the photo and you get to choose the place and you get to choose that the one that makes you and your family look the best. So please get that emailed or text or smoke messaged to us so that we can get those things updated. That would be great. Speaking of photos communicate 1,000 things, right? A picture's worth 1,000 words. And as a dyslexic, I love photos because they allow me to read really quickly. Something happened. There we go. I don't know what happened there. Anyway, a photo will take you to all sorts of different places, right? You see a photo and it takes you to the past. It takes you to a past moment. Maybe it takes you back to interacting with somebody or thinking about somebody that you haven't seen in a while or maybe who has passed on. A picture is a wonderful thing. Now, the photos that are behind me on the screen this morning, instead of taking us to places that maybe we even want to go, they take us back to our computers, right? Because you've all seen these images. These are the images that are default on our computer screens, right? So you've had these as backgrounds. You've seen these on computers at the mall. These pictures are familiar to us. Well, all but one, that is. One of these photos is not like the others. I was on YouTube the other day, and I was watching some members here who were making their way through a cavern or a valley. And I had seen these images or images like them before as, default images on computer screens. And it was interesting to see Dean and Glenn walk their way through this narrow canyon. And what really struck me as I watched the video is that there was a point in time at which they had to take off their backpacks and kind of scoot sideways in order to make it through how narrow this canyon was. Now, the email that this came to me through talked about how this was a short 11-mile hike. And it was one of those moments, it's like, yeah, and that's exactly why I wasn't with them there in Utah, because I don't take short 11-mile hikes. That's a really long hike for me. As I interacted with them and got their permission to share this story, and you'll have to get Glenn's input as to exactly what all took place, it really was a walk of faith for them. They thought it was going to be a short hike, and it kind of became a journey all of its own, and luckily, they made it out safely and were able to upload videos and all those sorts of things. But there were times when they didn't know exactly what was ahead. Was it going to open back up and take them back to their vehicle, or where were they? It was kind of an adventure. And as I watched the video the first time, that was kind of one of the things that crossed my mind. What was it like for the first person who headed down that canyon, not knowing what lay ahead? Not knowing how much further you could make it up this canyon before you were going to have to turn back, or worse yet, maybe you got stuck. Right? It really represented kind of this idea of a walk of faith. Now, in our current series, we are looking at ways, and we're seeking to learn along the way from others who have gone before us as we walk through the journeys of life, as we walk through the deserts of life that have so much to teach us. Now, last week we looked at God's judgment upon Egypt and the 10 plagues that brought that judgment upon them. And the people of Israel leave Egypt in triumph. If we look over at Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 33, God says, the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all die. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, and their kneading bowls bound them in their cloaks and on their shoulders. And the people of Israel had done as Moses had told them, and they asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have whatever they asked for, and they plundered the Egyptians. When Israel left Egypt, they were leaving victorious. While the people of Israel did not realize what was going on at the time, God had begun a war with Egypt, and he was victorious. The Israelites did not have to lift a finger to win this battle. God won the battle for them, and he laid waste the land of Egypt. He judged the land of Egypt, and he allowed them to plunder the Egyptians as they left. They were willingly plundered. That's how defeated the Egyptians were as they left Egypt. We jump down to Exodus chapter 13, starting in verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went out of the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. So God makes a distinct choice as he leads the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. He makes a distinct choice. Instead of taking the short route, the short highway up straight into the land, God instead chooses to send them the way of the wilderness. God sends them the long way because he knows that they're not ready to fight. He knows that they're not ready for the conflict that would be ahead in taking the land of Canaan. He needs to prepare them. So he sends them another way. He makes this choice willingly, and it's interesting to me how God chooses to lead his people. In Exodus chapter 13, jumping down to verse 21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. And the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. God chose to lead the people out. There was no question as to whether they had taken a wrong turn. There was no need to recalculate the GPS because God was the one leading them. In this wonderful pillar of cloud by day, this pillar of fire by night, the people of Israel always knew where they needed to go. God was leading them. Now, this is graduation season, right? Lots of people are graduating from both high school and elementary schools and from colleges. Lots of people are beginning new stages of life or have begun new stages of life in a journey of marriage or maybe a change of career. This is a season when lots of changes take place, lots of different paths take place. And I think we all wish that God would give us these kind of a smoke signal to lead us as to what direction we ought to go. Are we making the right decision? Because a Christian wants to do the will of God in their lives, right? We want to do what God's will is for us. We want to go the right direction. And as such, we wish that God would give us some sort of a GPS guidance of what direction our life should take. And we would love to have this kind of guidance, right? And while God does not necessarily come down or does not come in this way today, God does lead us. God is capable of leading us. And I think it's important that we learn some of the lessons of following God. There is no question that the people of Israel went the way that God wanted them to go. They were not in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were exactly where God wanted them every step of the way as they left Egypt. So what does it look like as we follow God? What does it look like when God sets the path before us as we follow the proverbial blue line and blinking dot as we go through this path of life? Now, as we look at the Exodus, just as a caveat, there's lots of theories. When it comes to taking the text of the Scriptures and putting that into our physical, modern, geographical locations, trying to piece together these stories is challenging. There's all sorts of different theories. There's all sorts of different paths that people think they took. I'm not going to get into that today. If you're interested in a deep dive of that, The Pattern of Evidences is a great series that really walks through all of the different theories and kind of steps back and says, you can decide. I like that approach. So if you're interested in getting into that or you want to talk to me in more depth about my opinions, I'm more than happy to do that. But we're not going to get into all those things today. But I will give you somewhat my opinion from my study, and this is open to interpretation, okay? So there's the caveat. I believe, from my study, that God led them out through one of the main trade routes across what is now modern day the Sinai Peninsula, right? And he leads them out along this way. That's what I believe was happening. Now, what I'm going to say about this, I think could have taken place and would be true of many of the other routes that could have been considered as well. But as they follow this trade route, God eventually, as they come near the Gulf of Aqaba, one of the forks in the Red Sea, God takes them on a detour down through a set of valleys. And he eventually brings them to what is known as the beach, modern day, of Nueve. And once they get there, they've been on a journey for about 18 days, and then God lets them rest for 7 days. They find themselves on a beach with mountains on one side and the Red Sea on the other, able to camp and relax. And I think they would have felt as if God had brought them to a safe haven, to a fortress, a place where they could be safe, a place where they could rest, a place where they could recoup, where they could worship God. And I think as you reflect back upon the path that the people of Israel had been on for, say, the last 60, 70 days, depending on how long some of these things took, it would have been quite the faith-building experience, wouldn't it? God reaches into Egypt with an outstretched mighty arm. He judges the nation of Egypt. He brings them out through all the 10 plagues. He then leads them victoriously out in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and he leads them for 18 days, and he brings them to a place where they can rest, where there's sand under their feet, where there is a cool breeze off of the Red Sea. It would have been a wonderful place. In Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 1, the Lord says something interesting to Moses. Tell the people of Israel to turn back and to encamp in front of Pil Harin, between Migdar and the sea, in front of Bel Zippor, and you shall camp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land of the wilderness, has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get the glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Now, like I said, it's hard to know exactly where these places are, to pinpoint these on our modern day map, to piece together all the archaeology. So maybe this is what took place. Maybe it looked a little bit different. But if I'm right about the path that they took, it would have been very similar to the path that Dean and Glenn took the other day in Utah. Because as you go through this path, as you make your way to the beach of Nueve, the valley comes to what looks to be a dead end. And then it turns, and it opens back up, and it gets narrow at times, and you kind of have to slowly make your way through, especially this huge crowd. And eventually you come to this beach, this open area. And I think we need to think about the way that the effect that would have had on the Israelites as they took that journey, if that's what happened. Because they would have been following God. They knew the direction God was leading them. And all of a sudden you come to a dead end. And then you look and, oh, we can go this way. And they make their way and they zig and they zag to this wonderful place of provision. But God has a plan that's bigger than simply giving them rest. See, God did this to show himself strong. God did this to teach them to trust him, to teach them to follow him. But he also did it to show himself glorious and to finish off his judgment of Egypt. So all of a sudden, as they sit there upon the beach, as they rest, an alarm goes out. The Egyptians are coming, and what was once a place of refuge becomes a place of captivity once more. What was once a sanctuary becomes a tomb. There's no way out. The only way out is where the Egyptians are. And Israel does what we so often do in such situations. We cry out to God, "What were you thinking? Why did you bring us here? There's no way forward. What were you thinking, God? Why? I must have made a mistake. I must have been following my own thoughts. I ended up in this place where there's no way out." But God had a plan. God had a path forward that they couldn't see, that only He could open. God had shown Himself strong again and again and again in the last few days that the Israelites had experienced. They had seen the 10 plagues that had brought the mightiest nation on earth at the time to its knees. They had seen God lead them to a place of provision. And as soon as there was trouble, their first thought, as a pillar of cloud stood there, their first thought was, God led us here to die because there wasn't enough graves in Egypt. Don't we do the same thing? When God brings us to a place and we don't see a way out, when we don't see a way forward, we say, why did you bring us here to die? Right? We're not so different. We're not so different. But God had a plan. God made a path through the sea. God opened up a way that only He could open up to bring Himself glory. He caused a strong wind to blow, and he dried the land so that they not only had a path forward, but they had a place to lay their feet that was dry, that was not mud-filled. As the huge crowd made their way across the Red Sea to a place of safety. God, while all of this is happening, acts as a rear guard. He moves to the rear of the camp instead of the head of the camp, and He stands between the Egyptians and the Israelites. He makes sure that neither group goes near the other while they cross. And then God retreats back to the other side and allows the Egyptians to see what has been transpiring. And they foolishly decide to follow. They pursue. And God says, And God shuts the Red Sea. He shuts the way that He had made open for the Israelites, and He drowns the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, showing Himself victorious in a final battle against Egypt. It doesn't matter where you have these events take place. It doesn't matter what path the people of Israel took. What happened here was a miracle. What happened here was fantastical, because there is no other way to put it. God was showing Himself provident over all of these things. God was making a way where there was no way. God was protecting the people, leading the people, and judging a nation for their actions. As we think about this story, we see a God who is worthy to be followed, don't we? We see a God who knows what's going on, who has a plan. We see a God who is mighty to do what needs to be done. We see a God who is willing to lead His people, guide His people, and in the end, save His people. We see a God who knows how to lead His people. But as we reflect upon this, we see a difficult walk of faith, don't we? Sometimes it's hard to know what way to go. Sometimes we're following God's will and we think we're in the right, and we're going the right direction, and all of a sudden we come to a dead end and we don't know where we're going to go, and then it opens up again and we go back another direction, and it feels maybe like we're lost, and then we get to a place and it's like, yes, God has provided for me. There's this wonderful beach, and the next thing you know, what was once provision turns into death. Sometimes that's what a walk of faith looks like. Now, we have to be careful when it comes to this, right? Sometimes our own ideas lead us into bad situations. Sometimes our own desires lead us into places and situations that God was like, I tried to warn you. But I think if we're honest, if we're seeking good godly counsel, if we're truly trying to submit ourselves to the will of God, God will lead us. God will guide us as we try to navigate the difficulties of life. But I think it's also important to know that God is not so dependent upon us making the right decisions every step of the way that somehow we're going to get ourselves into a situation, if we're honestly seeking Him, that God's going to say, well, if you had just listened to me earlier, if you had caught that little nudge that I gave you earlier, you wouldn't be in this mess, so you're just going to have to deal with it. Right? That's not the God I know. So long as we're honestly seeking Him, so long as we're honestly trying to follow Him, God will show Himself victorious. As we continue to follow the Israelites through the desert, they're going to make mistake after mistake after mistake. And yet God works in and through them. As the Israelites are arguing down in the camp, God is up on the mountain, up in the areas around the camp, protecting them as Balaam tries to curse the people, but can only bless them. Right? It's okay if we make mistakes. We need to seek Him. We need to seek to do right. But it's okay to make mistakes at times. And I think it's important for us to understand that. Also, as I reflect upon the guiding of Israel through this time, I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 1, Paul says, "For I want you not to be aware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they all drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, the rock that was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." As Paul reflects upon what we've been studying this morning, he says what they were doing, the journey that they were on, is the same one we are on. It's a walk of faith. In the same way that Israel followed God through the heart of the sea, in the same way that they were baptized through the sea, so too we in Christ are baptized as we walk by faith. Not something that we do, but something that He does to us as we submit our lives to Him. And as Christians, this is a reminder for us to be obedient, to follow, to walk by faith, unsure of what the path looks like ahead. As Pharaoh heard reports of the Israelites, he said they're wandering lost in the wilderness. They've been hemmed in. I can take them out. Sometimes as we go through the journey of life, it looks like we are wandering in the wilderness, hemmed in. But God is with us, and He calls us to continue that walk by faith. And He reminds us, Paul calls us to be reminded of how we submitted ourselves to the will of God, to what He called us to as we were baptized, as we came up pure and clean, and to continue that walk, to continue that journey, to continue to be faithful. Now, for those who are not Christians, I want to encourage you to walk by faith, to take those steps of faith, to seek to follow God, to seek to know Him. That's what this whole series is about, is to learn the lessons that Israel is learning along the way, to seek to not make the same mistakes that they made. And I encourage you to consider walking by faith, to understand it's not always an easy task, but it is a beneficial one. And maybe as you walk by faith, you have all sorts of questions. We have free Bibles available here. If you need one, we'll get you one. But maybe you already have one and you've been reading, and you have questions about this book. We'd love to answer those questions. We'd love to walk alongside you and help you come to understand what the Word of God means, how to live it out. Maybe you have been studying, and maybe you know what you need to do. Maybe you know that it's time to submit yourself and to die to yourself in a water grave of baptism. The water's ready. So however we can assist you in your walk of faith, maybe that's through prayer, encouraging you through the difficulties of life, helping to give you wise counsel as you make decisions and as you seek to follow God. Maybe that's through study, to seek to understand the will of God and what He calls us to do as we begin that journey of faith. Or maybe it's beginning that journey of faith this morning by putting Christ on in baptism. However we can assist you in your walk of faith, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.